Hey everyone! I came across some interesting articles recently analyzing new data about how people responded to the coronavirus lockdowns. It's pretty fascinating stuff that motivated me to dig a little deeper into the numbers, and I wanted to share what I found. So, in this video, I ask, have the statewide coronavirus lockdowns been effective? I know this is a controversial subject, so there's one thing I wanted to clarify before I continue. Lockdowns are not the same as social distancing. Social distancing is a set of practices that have been shown to effectively prevent the spread of diseases such as COVID-19. These practices include keeping 6 feet of separation from other people, wearing masks, avoiding large crowds, and in extreme cases, sheltering in place. The lockdowns are state-level executive mandates designed to enforce social distancing. Anyone that conflates the two is assuming that people would not practice social distancing on their own without being told to do so. But is this assumption fair? I wanted to find out, which is why in this video, I question whether the lockdowns have been necessary at the state level to achieve social distancing and slow the spread of COVID-19. In other words, would the public have engaged in social distancing voluntarily, even if there weren't any lockdowns? Or perhaps on a less extreme note, would lockdowns have been better if they were managed at the local level?
So, where are these questions coming from? I began asking myself about the lockdowns after seeing some articles online that analyze behavioral data. The first, published by the statistics website FiveThirtyEight on May 8th, has the headline, Americans didn't wait for their governors to tell them to stay home because of COVID-19. The second is from the New York Times and looks at the opposite end of the lockdowns, detailing how people have started to leave home as states loosen restrictions. Both articles rely on data from Cubic, an analytics company that has been tracking quarantine behavior with smartphone location data. The creepiness of that aside, it does give us some brilliant insight into how people dealt with the lockdowns. The data is also free on Cubic's website, and while I didn't have the time to go and look at the raw data myself, I encourage you to look into it and draw your own conclusions. While the data presented in these articles is interesting, it's hard to grasp with such a complex question about the effectiveness of the lockdowns. So, for this video, I've broken down lockdown effectiveness into 4 yes or no questions. Did the state level lockdowns persuade people to practice social distancing, up to and including sheltering in place? Persuade anyone who wasn't social distancing to begin doing so? Increase social distancing beyond what people were willing to do voluntarily? Prevent a decrease in social distancing over time? If we can definitively answer yes to any of these 4 questions, we can make an argument that the coronavirus lockdowns have been effective. To answer the first 2 questions, we look at the article from FiveThirtyEight. They published charts detailing how people began to respond to the pandemic as conditions worsened globally in March. The charts show the change in people staying at home now versus whether they stayed home during the same time in 2019. The higher the trend climbs, the more people are sheltering. The vertical dotted lines on each chart show when a lockdown order was enacted by that state's governor. There are a few observations we can make about these charts. Firstly, they all more or less look the same. This is important since not every state enacted a lockdown order at the same time, while a few states did not enact a lockdown order at all. Can you find them? Not as easy as you might think, but we'll get to this later. Secondly, the introduction of a lockdown order did not seem to have any significant impact on any state. Sheltering in place either had already leveled off or continued the same trend for a short while before leveling off. There were no spikes in sheltering that can be attributed to the lockdown orders. And finally, once sheltering leveled off, it stayed there. Even as lockdown orders aged and the cases started to pile up, the amount of people sheltering stayed constant. If anything, sheltering in some states began to decrease after orders were introduced, such as in Illinois, Wisconsin, Vermont, and Michigan. The most interesting of these observations is that people were sheltering before governors issued their lockdown orders. FiveThirtyEight discusses this in their article, saying behavioral changes were largely driven by people making a voluntary choice to stay home, rather than being forced to by a state-sanctioned stay-at-home order. They also discuss why this phenomenon occurred, attributing the behavior to the general state of affairs in early March. The stock market was crashing, Italy was falling apart, major sports were canceling their seasons, and many communities had begun enacting their own quarantines by closing schools, forcing parents to work from home to look after them. All these factors contributed to sheltering in place that occurred largely without any statewide order in place. Let's look back at our 4 questions to keep score. Did the state-level lockdowns persuade people to practice social distancing and shelter in place? Considering the actions taken at the local level and the choices made by people who were concerned about getting sick, Anyone who was going to stay home was already doing so before governors enacted their order. So the answer to that is a definitive no. What about persuading people who weren't socially distancing to get with the program? Well, as we saw, sheltering plateaued shortly before or after orders went into effect, and any change that occurred was a decrease in sheltering. Therefore, the answer to that question is a strong no as well. Now we can move on to question 3, which isn't as cut and dry as the first two. Here's where the New York Times article sheds some light on the matter. Unlike the FiveThirtyEight article, the New York Times went and provided numbers for each state in table form. They showed the average percentage of the population that was staying at home during peak sheltering and how that percentage has changed since then. They also categorized the states based on the current status of their lockdown policies as of May 12th, the date of publication. There were states that still had their lockdowns in effect, states that reopened between May 1st and May 8th, states that reopened before April 30th, and states that never enacted lockdown orders. With these categories, we can compare behavior between states with lockdown orders and states that were open. Overall, states that enacted lockdown orders at some point saw a 6.4 point advantage in the peak percentage of their populations that were sheltering. The 42 states that had lockdown orders saw a 43.4% sheltering peak, while states without lockdown orders only saw a sheltering peak of 37%. So pretty open and shut, right? Well, not exactly. It turns out there are other factors that influence sheltering, as the Times explains. For people in rural states, sheltering in place was a taller task than it was for people in metro states. The Times broke down states by whether they were urban, suburban, or rural, and noticed a striking difference in peak sheltering between them. The less urban a state was, the smaller the sheltering population. The Times explains that people in rural areas often needed to travel longer distances for basic necessities. As a result, while urban states saw peak sheltering of 47%, rural states on average saw a full 10% drop off in peak sheltering at 37%. Now that we've established there is a competing explanation for why a state might see less sheltering, we must rule it out before concluding that the lack of lockdown orders is to blame. To rule out other explanations, we need to determine whether the states without lockdown orders are urban, suburban, or rural. Let's take a look at that list of open states again. Unfortunately, the Times did not elaborate on how they classified states, but we can use population density as a rough guide. The 8 states without lockdown orders had an average population density of 32 people per square mile. Arkansas was the most densely populated with 57.2 people per square mile. When we compare this to a metropolitan state like New Jersey, which has over 1,200 people per square mile, it is reasonable to classify all of the open states as rural. Now let's take a look at that peak sheltering chart again. This time we're going to control for state type and only compare open states to all rural states. When you remove urban and suburban states from analysis, we can see that the bump in sheltering from earlier vanishes. An important thing to note about this is not proof that the statewide lockdowns did not increase social distancing. There are likely several other factors that contribute to sheltering behavior, and it will take years of study to uncover all of them. All this shows is that there is little, if any, available evidence right now to suggest that statewide lockdowns do increase social distancing. This is an important distinction. Going back to our 4 questions, while we lack any evidence that lockdowns increase social distancing, we also can't say that they don't increase social distancing either. Because of this, the only thing we know for sure is that the data is inconclusive. This brings us to our last question. Have the lockdowns prevented a decrease in social distancing over time? We turn back to the Times article for an answer. Using the lists provided by the Times, we can once again compare states that implemented a lockdown policy against those that did not. In the case of sheltering over time, states with a lockdown order have seen a 16% decline in the size of their sheltering populations, while open states have seen a decline of 21%. That 5% difference seems large, but like we saw before, there are additional factors that impact sheltering. We need to control for as many as we can before drawing conclusions. In the case of sheltering over time, we need to control for both state type and the status of their lockdown policies. This becomes an inexact science since the Times did not provide a list of which states they considered to be urban, suburban, or rural. I turned back to population density to try and replicate their analysis and ended up with this. States with a population density of 200 people per square mile or higher were classified as urban. States with a population density between 100 and 199 people per square mile were suburban, and states with a population density below 100 were rural. Looking back at the Times data for urban, suburban, and rural states, we can see that while my average peak sheltering data for each state type does not match theirs exactly, it's reasonably close. On top of this, we need to consider lockdown policy status as well. Let's recall how the Times divided this up. They listed states that currently have shelter-in-place orders in effect. We'll call those states closed. States that lifted restrictions between May 1st and May 8th, we'll say those states are exiting lockdowns. States that lifted restrictions before April 30th, we'll say those states have reopened. And finally, states that never had lockdown orders, which are just open. After you combine these two factors together, you end up with a table that looks like this. 14 closed urban states and 1 exiting, 6 closed suburban states and 5 exiting, 7 closed rural states, 4 exiting, 5 reopened, and 8 open. This data is only accurate up to the time of publication of the Times article, May 12th. Also, in case you were wondering, that one urban state that is exiting, it's Florida. When you control for all these variables, the chart now looks like this. Red bars represent closed states, orange represents exiting, beige represents reopened, and green represents open. In urban states, there is only a 1% difference in the decline of their sheltering population size. Suburban states saw a 2% difference, but also have a greater decline in sheltering overall than urban states. Rural states saw the greatest decline in the size of their sheltering population among states that have reopened, a whole 7%. Interestingly, this decline is greater than in states that have never had lockdown orders at all. There are going to be a lot of factors that play into this, but it's worth questioning if these states would have seen more sheltering now if they had never implemented lockdown orders in the first place. As for this chart as a whole, whether these mostly marginal differences in sheltering are significant is up for debate. I'm sure there are people that see the greater declines among states with loosened restrictions as somber examples of the dangers of reopening. For me, the more important takeaway is that those red bars exist at all. If a state has not changed anything about their shelter-in-place orders, then why has the sheltering population not remained steady? Shouldn't the decline in sheltering among closed states be 0%? Shouldn't people in closed states be obeying their orders and staying home? When viewed from this perspective, a 1, 2, or even 7% difference in sheltering populations suddenly looks a lot less meaningful. Let's look back at our questions again. When we ask if statewide lockdowns prevented a decrease in social distancing over time, we can acknowledge that there are some differences depending on state policy, while conceding that those differences lose significance when you consider the purpose of those policies. A state that has implemented lockdown orders should expect its citizens to abide by those orders until they are lifted. In reality, people left home regardless of what their governors are saying. In that respect, the answer to question 4 is a conclusive no. With our final tally, we have answered no to 3 of our 4 questions and do not have enough data to reasonably answer one of them. In short, we have failed to find evidence that the lockdowns achieved any of their goals, no matter how well intentioned. At this time, the available data suggests that the statewide lockdowns are failed policy. To summarize, people took it upon themselves to stay home without the need for a statewide lockdown. Anyone who was going to socially distance was already doing so before the orders were given. We are unable to show that sheltering increased in states with lockdowns, and people have begun to leave their homes even if lockdown orders are still in place. All of this then begs the question, what exactly did the lockdowns accomplish? Well, they prompted armed protests at government buildings. They've turned neighbors and communities against each other by encouraging people to snitch instead of minding their own business. And they've fanned the flames of the destruction of our protected rights and civil liberties. In some places, the situation has become so tense that armed militias are preparing to protect citizens from the state if they choose to ignore their governor's orders. We are seeing a complete unraveling in our social fabric, one that was weakened to begin with, at the hands of these lockdowns. And even if these consequences are worth whatever unproven impact the lockdowns had on slowing the spread of COVID-19, any benefit of the statewide lockdowns has likely been nullified by other disastrous policies, such as the Trump administration's refusal to distribute the national medical equipment stockpile, or perhaps more egregiously, the decision by some governors to force nursing homes to accept COVID-19 positive patients. As has been well documented, a significant amount of COVID-19 deaths have come from nursing homes. In some cases, they represent the majority of deaths. And yet, Tom Wolf of Pennsylvania, Gretchen Whitmer of Michigan, Andrew Cuomo of New York, Gavin Newsom of California, and Phil Murphy of New Jersey all had, at one point, a policy in place that required nursing homes to accept COVID-19 positive patients. There's an argument to be made that any gains in slowing the spread achieved by the statewide lockdowns were completely wiped out by these policies that put the most vulnerable portion of the population at needless risk. Now that we've shown that statewide lockdowns have been, at best, ineffective policy, one question remains. What should we do now? To start, we should peacefully petition our state governments to end their lockdowns and delegate this authority to local communities. This will still enable government response to the pandemic without adopting the brutal scorched earth policy that caused so much unrest and division. The policies adopted by cities and towns should still involve bans on or warnings against large gatherings and school closures, as these are vectors for spread of disease. And finally, and most importantly, we need to start destigmatizing social interaction to ease tensions, instead adopting a narrative of practical social distancing measures we can take while visiting friends and family. Julia Marcus wrote an excellent article for The Atlantic advocating for this, drawing comparisons to the HIV/AIDS pandemic of the 1980s. When HIV first appeared, most doctors recommended abstinence as a means for stopping the spread. Of course, people like to have sex, so this advice fell on deaf ears. When doctors realized that recommending abstinence wasn't practical, they instead began an education campaign about safer sex practices to try and curb the spread of HIV. This change in tactics was much more effective, and it's something we need to be doing with COVID-19. Asking people to stay inside and watch Netflix indefinitely is just not realistic, and shaming people who do choose to venture outside isn't helpful. By encouraging everyone to be mindful of their hygiene and interactions when attending summer barbecues, we are utilizing a strategy that is not only more agreeable, but likely more effective in slowing the spread of COVID-19. It will also go a long way to repairing the damage we've inflicted upon our own social customs, because at a certain point, if COVID-19 doesn't destroy us, the lockdowns will. Thanks for watching my video. If you enjoyed it, please share, and don't be shy about leaving a comment if you have something to say. You can subscribe if you want to, but I don't really plan on making more videos. I've included links to all of my major references in the description, and all images have been used under fair use policy. Have a great day, and never stop asking questions.